Time to talk about some iconic elite heavy shock cavalry, the Grail Knights. This replay from the Emperor Bretonnia versus Wood Elves, and I quickly just wanted to address, I think some people might have gotten the misconception from this series that I'm some sort of cavalry shill, which, I mean, like, I am, but I do understand that there are significant issues, especially with heavy shock cavalry, more expensive heavy shock cavalry, and I'm not blind to these issues. I certainly am aware of them, and have been communicating with CA for some time about them through my own channels, back channels. And recently, on the first video in this series, Lotus Moon, who I always appreciate his insights, he's a super good player, like really, really strong player, very observant guy, and while I don't always agree with him on everything, I always appreciate his insights and his, thoughts. Always leads me to, think about my own position and sort of, realize some new things. And he made a very good point in his comment, which is that elite heavy shock cavalry currently is pressed into more of a supporting role, which is pretty sad, and I would largely agree with that. This replay is going to sort of showcase that to a pretty large degree. We've only got 2 Grail Knights here, which is pretty unusual, historically, against Wood Elves. Lots and lots of infantry. Already we're going with style points here. No Fey Double Paladin. Instead we've got King Lewin and a Damsel. Lore of Life. So already a plus 10 from me. He's got some Foot Squires, bit of an odd pick, but the Holy Wardens love them here. Lots of archers. And then the 2 Grail Knights. As for the Wood Elves, taking a very strong high ground position here. We've got some Starfire Shafts, cute cavalry of their own, light cavalry to be expected here. Blade Riders with spears, and the most elite, well, some of the most elite light cavalry in the game. Wild Riders, specifically the Regiment Renowned Wild Hunters of Kurnos. Their magic damage will be very good here. Against those Grail Knights, potentially. Lariel and Orion leading the way. Big old lag spike there. Sorry about that. Hopefully that doesn't ruin the recording. But anyway, so one of the issues that Lotus Moon raised in his comment is that you just can't really face charge, like you used to be able to with heavy shock cavalry as sort of the primary damage dealer. They are relegated now to supporting on the flanks. And that is largely true. Here, the Emperor is going to keep them well back, and this is a pretty smart idea. Wait until you've got some things engaged here, so you've got things scouted out, make sure there's no hidden units, you can start to occupy some of these archers' attentions, and now bringing in the elite cavalry sort of on the periphery to try and start to get some side and rear charges, start to get some good shock. One of the primary functions of shock cavalry, obviously, is to deal a lot of shock damage, and the way leadership works in Total War Warhammer is we see a Tempest pop on Lewin there. No line shield to resist that damage, but he did just fine, just taking it on the chin there and healing through it. Anyway, shock cavalry, they do shock damage, right? High charge, usually. I mean, yes, it's kind of defined as shock cavalry, you need a good charge bonus, right? And like here, quick order reselection, they get a quick charge on the Eternal Guards and then directly going after the Glade Riders, which is smart. The Glade Riders are the thing that could kind of pin them up against the Eternal Guards here and lead to them kind of taking some damage. Grail Knights over on the other flank, same thing, getting into position to possibly threaten on some side or rear charges. And the biggest thing is just to keep them moving, right? You don't want them to fight and sustain combat against those anti-large AP units, which, to be fair, was the case before. But, yeah, now over here, again, counterpunching, another function that they're sort of relegated to in that support role is counterpunching units that overextend, and they are going to do that beautifully here, just absolutely punishing this Eternal Guard as it overextends. Did manage to do some pretty good damage, and man, excuse me, those Foot Squires just got absolutely lit up. That is tough for them. A little bit of an odd matchup, and I did want to highlight this here also. I'm not sure if this was a mistake or what, but these Men-at-Arms get a regrowth, which, to be fair, they still have most of their unit models left, and they are healing a significant amount of HP. Granted, value-wise, I'm not sure about that. Sort of a bit sus, but you'll have to let me know, Emperor, if that was a misclick or if that was intentional. Might have been a million IQ play, but anyway, more Grail Knights just trying to take out here. A little bit of a mistake, I think, by the Wood Elf player, charging in. If he had the Wild Hunters of Kurnos, like, in a position to charge into the side here, then it would have been worth sacrificing those Glade Riders, but they end up just getting absolutely canned. The other Grail Knights here, this is sort of one of the interactions that people have an issue with, right, is charging into something like this. You see how much damage the Grail Knights take, and I mean, granted, there's a few factors at play. Race of Frozen Heart have pretty good melee attack and magic damage, so they're cutting through that physical resistance, and already pretty good attack, well, with Frenzy. Once the Frenzy drops, not quite so good, but they are doing a pretty good amount of damage to the Grail Knights in return. Of course, with the Frostbite, as their Eternal Guards start to filter in as well, they'll sort of get more unit models caught up, and Grail Knights will have a hard time pulling away. So like that, I understand, is an interaction that a lot of people, is sort of emblematic of the problems that people have with Cavalry, right? You would think, you know, Grail Knights are literally, what, double the cost of the Race of the Frozen Heart? You would think they'd be able to come in and just clean them up easy on the charge, where in fact they actually end up having to pull away there, and granted, part of that's due to the Eternal Guards. They probably would have won the engagement if they would have been able to stay the course the whole time, but still, Grail Knights here with Lewin, again, in the supporting role. Once the mobs kind of occupy these Blade Guards, Grail Knights can charge in and start to do that cleanup along with Lewin. Just rinsing and repeating. But this, yeah, eventually the Grail Knights here, they do turn around, get a countercharge on the Race of the Frozen Heart, and are pretty much able to break them, but even still, just taking a lot of really cost-inefficient damage in the process from the Eternal Guards and from the Race. So that's not the best situation. I think is sort of emblematic of a lot of the issues that people have with Cavalry, which are very real. I don't want to dismiss those. Like, I think that especially the interactions with, like, mid-tier Great Weapon or otherwise DPS infantry, those interactions specifically, I think, are the biggest problem. But really nice downhill sort of column charge of those Grail Knights through the center of those Starfire shafts, just absolutely plowing models out of the way. Hills, of course, will give you weapon strength and speed buff, both of which do affect charge, obviously. I mean, weapon strength is pretty direct, but speed is a little bit harder to quantify, but this is a rough situation for the Grail Knights to be in. The Wild Hunters of Kurnos here, Berry Wine is healing them, and also, you know, magic damage, massive charge. They probably should have stayed the course in those Grail Knights. Instead, they peel to try and take out these Men-at-Arms, but they kind of had those Grail Knights up against the ropes there. They could have potentially taken out the unit, but instead, coming through and just cleaning up more of these tattered units. Orion also out here. I haven't really been highlighting him too much, but Orion with his physical resistance now, and the fact that Cloak of Isha doesn't give as much damage resistance as it did before, the Grail Knights will actually have a really good engagement here as they get a beautiful open field charge. Orion, without much armor, relying on that physical resistance, will take a lot of damage, but the Wild Hunters of Kurnos in a position to support. They no longer have Guardian, but they still will come in and just deal a ton of damage, probably shatter that unit of Grail Knights. So some nice counterpunch from the Wood Elves. Things are looking pretty grim overall, though, as a lot of their forces are sort of tattered to the wind. Lewin and this other Grail Knight here are still quite healthy. So the Grail Knight going to get a little bit of Earth Blood there to restore their HP. Continuing to mop up all sorts of light and tattered units. And really, they've just been, you know, in terms of supporting, like, I guess you could say they're not the primary... They sort of have been the primary damage dealers here, but really just coming in, you know, on the side and rear when units are already fixed, right? That's sort of what I mean by support, relegated to a supporting role. Attacking on the flanks, counterpunching, all of those things that we saw here are sort of more support-type roles, right? Rather than your primary, you could say, damage dealer just charging directly in the face. And this is still a matchup, I would say, where Bretonnia sometimes can get away, just because Dryads, they will trade okay counter-charging into Cavalry, but not as good as something like a dedicated Great Weapon, and you still will see a lot of Eternal Guards in this matchup often. It's arguably not the best example for that specifically, but yeah, you can see that Orion here and the Wild Hunters form a pretty good pocket. These Grail Knights were kind of snooping around, seeing if they could get an opening here, but very wisely just pulling back to support as Lewin absolutely just deals with Ilaria. Or Ariel, sorry. I make that mistake way too much, honestly. Nice rear charge there from the Grail Knights on those Eternal Guards, helping to take out those support units, and man, those Men-at-Arms also. Wow, credit to them fighting until the very late game. I guess that was the unit that got healed, huh? Amazing. Just absolutely amazing. But again, Ilaria, like Orion, low armor, relies on physical resistance, so and she doesn't have Cloak of Isha, right? So she's just going to get straight up canned in a surround by these Grail Knights. She does manage to pop one Spiteful Soul Stealer. It does actually go off, not in time to save her from army losses, but yeah, Grail Knights racked up a ton of value just in that little bit of extra late game. And again, in support of their king, we can see the final charge here against Orion as everything else is hit. Army losses, Orion, of course, being unbreakable, will fight to the bitter end. But yeah, that magic weapon damage, you can see them just getting really good hits against Orion. And the fact they have, you know, anti-large, high weapon strength, I mean, high-ish weapon strength, they're able to deal with him with Lewin. So very fun replay. Big thanks to the Emperor for sending that one in. Kind of odd the Emperor playing as Bretonnia, but anyway, just bad joke. Anyway, yeah, the Grail Knights though. Look at the value on these guys. 2,600 damage value. 1,500 on the other one, so both of them pay for themselves. One of them plus, 1,100 overpaying for themselves, even outperforming Lewin himself, which is very impressive. And I mean, granted, this is arguably like the ideal matchup for Grail Knights. A lot of physical resistance, a lot of kind of low health, light units to charge. So, granted, you would expect them, if they were well microed, to perform well here. So, but I guess it was just sort of goes to show if you use them in that supporting role, you're very conscious with your micro, you can still get amazing value out of heavy cavalry. And I guess that's one of my points of this series overall, is with good implementation, with the correct, deployment, micro, strategy, everything else, you can get excellent value from all cavalry, but especially heavy shock cavalry. I mean, a lot more so than people would have you think. Not that there aren't problems, you have to use them differently than you did in the past, and that in and of itself could be seen as a problem. I sort of agree there as a heavy cavalry enjoyer. It makes me sad that I can't do some of the things that I was able to do previously, right? So, but yeah, in that sort of supporting role, right, getting side and rear charges, counterpunching units that overextend, helping to support lords and heroes, multi-charging from different angles in support of other units, in that role, they can still obviously be very, very effective. Wild Hunters of Kronos, likewise, sort of a similar situation, very good value. The Glade Riders pay a pretty hefty price, but pretty good stuff for all the Elven infantry you would expect. Kind of a little bit of a mixed bag. The one thing for the Emperor Foot Squires, you just replace these guys with more Battle Pilgrims. There's not really a reason to take Foot Squires here. Anyway, so the Elite Shock Cavalry, and this is more of a problem for them. Elite Melee Cavalry was already sort of a weird one before, and you do still see them sometimes, but, I mean, their higher defense means that they don't have as much issues, just because, like, a lower tier unit, for example, like a Marauder Great Weapon, they've got, what, 54 effective attack on the charge, I mean, 56 defense for Grail Guardians, plus the physical resistance, so they're not going to take as much damage, right? And they probably won't be countercharging as much anyway, because they're going to be sitting in a sustained combat more often than not. And whereas Grail Knights, if they're getting countercharge while they're charging in, while they're cycle charging, that's going to be a problem for them, right? Now, I do think some of the interactions are a little bit overblown, like usually charging a sub 500 cost infantry, with an elite cavalry, you're going to break them pretty quickly, just because they're leadership. I mean, if they're not undead, obviously, they actually have leadership, and they'll run away, you can usually break them pretty quickly. It's the, like, sort of 500 to maybe, like, 1,000 cost infantry, maybe even less, like 500, like 850, 900 cost infantry, like your Marauder Great Weapons, or even like Empire Halberdiers, who you probably should be bracing, but it's probably actually better to countercharge with, in many instances. Dwarf Warriors, Great Weapons, like, these units are a third of the cost of the Elite Cavalry in many cases, but you still don't want to charge them in the face, and this is an issue. Like, yes, don't get me wrong, this interaction is something absolutely that needs to be looked at, but I guess from my perspective, as sort of I've played all the Total Wars right when they were new, and not that I played multiplayer a lot in the past, I sort of dabbled in it a tiny bit in Shogun and Rome 2, or Shogun 2 and Rome 2. Like in Rome 2, there is very much a heavy infantry meta, right? Like, and it makes sense given, the time period, sort of the theming around Rome. Roman legionaries are sort of their iconic thing, right? So it makes sense that you would have a heavy infantry kind of based around that. Attila, for example, has a much more cavalry-focused meta. Cavalry just absolutely annihilates everything in Attila. And it makes sense because, it's the Hunnic invasion, the cavalry hordes, like, descending on the civilized world, so it makes sense that the cavalry would be sort of the power piece in that game. Total War Warhammer's uniqueness comes from its monsters and magic and sort of that sort of thing, right? So those things do need to be usable, and I think, monsters have kind of oscillated back and forth. Right now, they're not really in the best place, which is a problem in and of itself, separate from this whole Cav issue. But for me, like, I guess as a sort of Total War, historical Total War fan as well, I don't want the monsters and magic and everything else, I guess really just the monsters and magic to supersede, like, basic infantry, right? Like, there have been times in the past where, you know, you could charge even a light cavalry unit into a braced spear unit from the front and pretty much not necessarily win, but, you know, you could deal with them quite efficiently. Like, and, you know, it just felt like in the past, infantry didn't exist. Now they've gone a little bit too far in the other direction, and I think it's pretty close to actually where it needs to be. I think just some of these interactions with cavalry, once they're addressed, and maybe the monsters are tweaked just a little bit more to be a little bit more powerful, then I think we'd be in a pretty good spot. But I don't know, what do you guys think overall? I personally don't have the biggest problem with cavalry being primarily a support unit, except that you then look at like Bretonnia as a faction where their primary power comes from their cavalry, and you say, okay, maybe in the case of like this faction or some other factions, they actually do have some legitimate, like the core power of the roster is in their cavalry. It's a little bit tricky to try and balance, I think, but let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Are you okay with cavalry being in a support role? Do you think they should be primary damage dealers? Somewhere in the middle. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. Yeah, if you like this sort of content, be sure to like, subscribe, hit that bell notification, all that jazz. We'll see you next time.